The private dining room on the 42nd floor of Valencrest Tower was silent in a way that made most people uncomfortable. The kind of silence that felt heavy rather than peaceful, broken only by the faint hum of the city, far below, and the soft clink of silverware, moving with deliberate precision. And at the center of it all sat Adrian Vale, a self-made millionaire, whose name was whispered with admiration in boardrooms and resentment in back alleys, a man whose fortune had been built on innovation and discipline, yet whose world existed without sound. Because Adrian had been profoundly deaf since the age of 9, after a car accident stole his hearing and his parents in the same brutal moment, leaving him to grow up surrounded by people who spoke endlessly but rarely truly communicated with him. And now, years later, even with his tailored suit, polished watch, and a table set for 5 though only one chair was occupied, he dined alone again as he always did, reading the lips of waiters who had memorized his preferences and avoiding eye contact out of habit rather than rudeness, because eye contact often led to pity, and pity was something Adrian despised more than loneliness. The restaurant was exclusive, invitation only, perched above the city like a throne room for the elite. Yet no laughter reached Adrian's world. No music, no casual chatter, only visual fragments of other diners smiling, leaning in, sharing moments he could observe but never fully feel. And as he cut into his food with exact movements, his eyes briefly drifted to the empty chairs around him, a reminder that success had filled his accounts but hollowed his personal life, and tonight was no different. Or so it seemed until a small, unnoticed detail began to shift the course of everything down the hallway. Beyond the dining room, a cleaning lady named Marisol moved quietly with her cart, pushing a mop and bucket as she had done every evening for the past 3 months, her uniform slightly worn, her shoulders tired but her eyes alert. Because she had learned long ago that when you cleaned places meant for powerful people, you learned to become invisible. And tonight she wasn't alone, because strapped gently against her chest in a soft cloth carrier was her 6-month-old baby boy, Matteo, whose wide eyes absorbed the world with unfiltered curiosity, a baby too young to understand class, wealth, or silence, and Marisol had brought him out of necessity, not rebellion, because her babysitter had canceled last minute and missing a shift meant risking a job she desperately needed. So she worked with one hand, steadying the mop, and the other, occasionally touching Matteo's back, whispering apologies he couldn't understand but somehow felt. And as she passed the private dining room, she slowed instinctively, because babies sense things adults have learned to ignore, and Matteo's gaze locked onto Adrian through the glass partition, a single man seated at a large table, his posture straight but his eyes distant, and something about that image stirred the baby, who let out a soft coo that Marisol tried to hush, panicking slightly because noise, even small ones, were frowned upon in this part of the building. But before she could turn away, something extraordinary happened. Matteo raised his tiny hand and began to move his fingers in a clumsy, untrained motion that was not random, not a wave, not a grab, but a crude, imperfect imitation of a sign Adrian knew better than any spoken word. Because the baby was unknowingly signing, copying movements he had seen. Marisol practiced late at night while studying sign language videos on her phone, movements she didn't even realize Matteo had absorbed. And Adrian froze mid-motion, his fork hovering above the plate as his eyes snapped to the glass, his heart stuttering in disbelief. Because in all his years of wealth and isolation, in rooms filled with executives and assistants and admirers, no one had ever attempted to speak to him in his language without being prompted, trained, or paid to do so. And yet here was a baby, barely able to sit up, fingers curling and uncurling, in a messy but unmistakable attempt at the sign for hello. And for the first time that evening, Adrian's carefully controlled expression cracked, his eyes widening, his breath catching as a rush of emotion surged through him so suddenly it left him unsteady, because that single innocent gesture pierced through years of guarded solitude. And Marisol noticed Adrian's reaction too late, her face flushing with embarrassment as she quickly turned away, whispering a frantic apology to Matteo, unaware of the storm she had just unleashed. But Adrian stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor as nearby diners glanced over in surprise, and he moved toward the glass, pressing his palm against it in a silent, urgent response, returning the sign with flawless clarity, his fingers steady, his expression no longer guarded but open, almost vulnerable, and Matteo squealed with delight, bouncing slightly, responding with more excited movements that made no sense linguistically but carried, Something far more powerful, recognition. And in that moment, two worlds that had never been meant to collide touched each other. A millionaire who had built walls around his silence and a cleaning lady's baby who knew nothing of those walls. And as Adrian signed slowly, deliberately, asking a question no one ever bothered to ask him, "What is your name?" Marisol turned back, stunned, tears threatening to spill as she realized that her baby had just done something no amount of money had ever bought Adrian Vale, and the chapter of his life defined by isolation was about to end. And if this story has already touched your heart, if you believe that sometimes the smallest hands can create the biggest changes, then pause for just a moment and subscribe to this channel, because stories like this remind us that humanity, kindness, and connection still exist in the most unexpected places, and you won't want to miss what happens next.